The cargo bay hummed with the low thrum of distant engines, and the air tasted faintly of iron and ozone. Dim, flickering lights cast long shadows over crates stamped with unknown alien sigils. A thick fog of tension filled the chamber as the crew of the warship Irindra's Claw gathered near the central holotable. Alien eyes, sharp and glowing with various hues, darted between one another. Every species present was a predator in its own right, clawed, fanged, armored, or exuding a predatory aura. But none of them dared speak first. They were all waiting for him. Boots echoed against the metal deck, slow, deliberate. Heavy steps with no attempt to mask their presence. A shadow stretched long before the figure emerged from the misty corridor, and as soon as he did, the entire room's energy shifted. Some of the crew straightened their spines. Others averted their eyes, their predatory instincts overwhelmed by something far older than reason: fear. "All right," said the man, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. He wore a standard-issue combat suit, its plates scuffed with burn marks, claw scratches, and deep gouges from encounters no one dared to ask about. His face was rugged, his jaw sharp as if carved from stone, and his eyes were what kept every alien in that room from questioning his authority. Calm, sharp, dangerous. "Who's gonna tell me why we're wasting time standing around?" The crew exchanged glances but said nothing. A towering reptilian captain with jagged teeth and scaled plating shifted forward, his claws clicking on the ground. "We await your command, human," he said, his voice low, guttural, and respectful in a way that didn't come naturally to his kind. The man raised a single brow, unimpressed. "If you need me to tell you when to act, Kravik, you've already lost." He stepped forward, his gaze sweeping across the crew like a storm front. "This isn't one of your ceremonial hunts. This is war." A smaller, fox-like creature with 4 glowing eyes let out a nervous chittering laugh. "Humans are always so dramatic," it muttered. "Am I?" The man's gaze snapped to the fox, like alien so fast it flinched as if a blade had been drawn. "Is that why your last crew begged for a human to save them when you got pinned down on Zalari Prime?" His steps brought him closer, slow and unyielding like a predator circling prey. "You want me to be less dramatic? Fine. Here it is, simple as I can put it. We hit them first. We hit hard, and we don't stop until they're done breathing." Silence. The fox-like alien lowered its head, eyes darting away. No one else dared speak. "Targets?" the man asked, turning to face the captain. Kravik nodded and tapped on the holotable. A glowing map of the star system flickered to life. The red blip of an enemy vessel hovered near the asteroid field of Yalarab 7, accompanied by a formation of smaller ships. Primary vessel is a cruiser-class battleship. Secondary escorts are 2 corvettes, lightly armed but fast. He glanced at the man. "They'll see us coming. Then we don't give them time to react," the man replied, folding his arms. His eyes were locked on the red blips, but his mind was already 4 moves ahead, calculating angles, firing solutions, and every possible mistake the enemy might make. "They'll expect us to wait for a clean shot. So, we don't. We ram them. Full speed. Shields up. No warning." A sharp intake of breath echoed from one of the crew. "A frontal charge? That's madness." The man's lips curled into a grin that was anything but friendly. "You call it madness. I call it certainty." He leaned forward, tapping the enemy cruiser with one calloused finger. "They see claws, spikes, and plasma cannons every day. What they don't see is someone stupid enough to hit them head-on. We'll be through their hull before they can power their main guns." The reptilian captain let out a huff, his jagged teeth flashing in what could almost be called a grin. "I see now why they fear humans." The man stepped back, eyes scanning every crew member. "No fear. No hesitation. If you see me run, you run. If you see me fight, you fight. But if you see me smile," he gave them all a pointed look, his grin sharp and predatory, "that means it's already too late for them." One by one, the crew nodded, their gazes sharp with renewed resolve. The fox-like alien muttered under its breath, "I'm starting to hate how much I like him." "Welcome to the club," said Kravik, his eyes still locked on the man. The thrum of the ship's engines intensified. The lights shifted from dim blue to the pulsing red glow of battle mode. Somewhere in the distance, the clang of mechanical systems locking into place echoed like a war drum. The man turned on his heel, his pace steady but quick, and the crew followed. Claws on metal. Boots on deck. A chorus of death approaching. The strongest alien crews always had a human, not for their strength, not for their speed, but for something far more primal. For the certainty that, when all else failed, a human would always find a way to win. The bridge of the Arindra's claw was bathed in the blood-red glow of battle readiness. The hum of the ship's core throbbed in sync with the rising tension. Every console was manned, every screen flickering with streams of tactical data. The crew's claws tapped at controls, eyes darting between readings and live feeds of the approaching enemy fleet. But all of them, every last one, kept sneaking glances at the humans standing at the helm. Enemy vessels closing, barked the navigator, a six-eyed insectoid named Grix. Her antennae twitched with unease as she relayed the readouts. Cruiser-class battleship, 3,000 kilometers and closing fast. Escorts flanking at high velocity. Her mandibles clicked nervously. They've locked targeting scanners on us. Good, the man muttered, arms folded as he leaned against the command console. His eyes were locked on the viewport ahead, where 3 distant specks of light glowed like dying stars. He didn't blink. Didn't flinch. The crew watched him like prey watching a predator decide whether to strike. Shields up. Kravik roared, his deep voice rumbling through the bridge. Weapons hot. Bring plasma cannons to full charge. The reptilian captain's claws gripped the edges of his command chair like he was ready to tear it apart. His eyes flicked toward the human, gauging him for any sign of doubt. But there was none. Just that maddening calm. Forget the cannons, the man said without turning his head. His voice was quiet but carried the weight of command. Full power to engines. All of it. Kravik's eyes narrowed, his scales bristling with confusion. If we do that, our shields will hold, the man interrupted, stepping away from the console. He glanced at the crew, his gaze sharp as a blade. This isn't a standoff, Captain. This is a sprint. Madness, Grix hissed, her antennae flattening against her head. We'll collide with the cruiser. That's the idea. His grin returned, sharper than ever. The bridge fell silent for a heartbeat, only the low hum of the ship's core filling the void. Then Kravik threw his head back and let out a deep, guttural laugh. Ha! I knew I liked you, human. He jabbed a clawed finger at the crew. You heard him. Divert all power to engines. I want this ship flying like a meteor with vengeance. Grix hesitated. If this fails... The man turned, locking eyes with her. If this fails, Grix, you won't be alive to care. Her antennae twitched in submission. Engines at full, she muttered, fingers darting over her console. Lights flickered as the ship systems reallocated power. The shield bar on her screen dropped to a fraction of its maximum, and the engines roared to life with a thunderous, guttural howl. The entire ship shuddered like a beast waking from a long slumber. The viewport ahead displayed a growing storm of metal. The enemy cruiser loomed larger now, its spiked hull bristling with gun emplacements. It was the kind of ship designed to intimidate entire fleets, a mobile fortress of death. Plasma cannons along its side began to glow with the blue-white charge of an imminent barrage. The 2 escort corvettes zipped ahead like darting predators, positioning themselves for a flanking assault. Here it comes, Kravik growled. His claws dug into his chair, his eyes locked on the enemy. Brace for impact. Don't brace, the man said, cracking his neck with a tilt of his head. His eyes were locked on the enemy cruiser, narrowing with laser focus. Lean in. The first volley came fast. Blue bolts of plasma streaked toward them, trailing wisps of ionized gas. Grix yelped, her claws dancing over the console. Incoming fire. Evasive. Hold course, the man snapped. What? You heard me, he said, voice sharp as a blade. Straight ahead. No deviation. The crew watched in wide-eyed horror as the incoming plasma bolts closed in. Closer. Closer. The lights on the bridge flickered with a flash as 2 shots hit the forward shield, sending shockwaves rippling through the ship. Sparks rained down from the overhead conduits, and Grix shrieked as she ducked behind her console. "We lost forward shielding," she cried. "Next hit breaches the hull." "Doesn't matter," the man said, his eyes never leaving the enemy ship. "They only get 1 shot." Kravik's eyes darted between the human and the viewport. "If you're wrong, human, I'll make sure your spirit feels every moment of the afterlife." "I'll let you know if I get there," he replied with a grin. The corvettes flanked them on either side, launching bursts of rapid-fire plasma. They hammered the Arindra's claw from both sides, the hull groaning under the strain. Damage alarms blared, red warning lights flashing like the heartbeat of the ship itself. "Corvette assault incoming," Grix shouted. "They're ripping us apart." "Let them," the man said, his eyes locked ahead. "Focus on the prize." Through the viewport, the enemy cruiser loomed larger than ever. It was close now, so close that individual hull plates could be seen, the scorch marks from past battles, the pockmarked surface of old impacts. The glow of its main cannon intensified, a brilliant sun-like orb charging for a single, devastating shot. "They're going to fire!" Grix howled. Her antennae twitched in frantic terror. "They're gonna hit us dead center." "Too late," the man muttered. The enemy's main cannon discharged. A blinding beam of blue-white plasma surged forth, searing through the void at the speed of light. But by the time it reached where the Arindra's claw had been, the ship was no longer there. It was inside. The viewport flashed as the Arindra's claw pierced the hull of the enemy cruiser like a spear through flesh. Metal crumpled inward, the deafening sound of collision reverberating through the ship. Sparks, debris, and fire erupted from every direction. The enemy cruiser lurched to the side, its internal systems shorting out from the catastrophic breach. The bridge of the Arindra's claw went dark for a moment as the impact rattled through every deck. Crew members were thrown from their seats, grunting as they slammed into walls and consoles. The crash webbing snapped into place around Kravik's chair, locking him in place as he bared his fangs in wild exhilaration. Grix pulled herself up, panting, her antennae twitching with shock. "Hull breach. We breached them." Her eyes widened in disbelief as she watched the sensor feed. "We're inside their ship." The man grinned as he unhooked the combat knife from his hip. "That's the thing about big, scary ships," he said, turning to face the crew. "They're only tough on the outside." The lights flickered back on, and his gaze shifted toward the internal hatch leading to the enemy vessel. Through the breach, smoke and sparks poured in from the other side, the sound of distant klaxons echoing from the cruiser's damaged hallways. "Arm up," he said as he strapped his helmet on, his voice cold and calm. "We're not done yet." Kravik's grin was a full display of teeth. "You're crazier than a Sarkhan blood beast, human." "I respect that." "Respect me later," the man said, locking eyes with him. "Fight now." The sound of weapons being cocked and loaded echoed through the bridge as the crew prepared for battle. The clatter of claws on metal and the hum of plasma rifles charging filled the air. They all knew what was coming next. The enemy knew it too. But that was the difference. The enemy was afraid. The humans were not. The lights in the breached corridor flickered like a dying heartbeat. Smoke and sparks filled the air, and the distant wail of emergency klaxons echoed through the narrow metal halls. Every shadow shifted like it had a mind of its own. But none of it fazed the human. He stepped through the jagged breach in the hull, boots crunching on twisted metal, his silhouette framed by firelight and ruin. Behind him, Kravik and the rest of the crew followed, weapons raised and eyes scanning every angle. Grix stayed close, her 6 eyes darting in all directions, her claws clutching a plasma carbine with a death grip. "Movement ahead," she whispered, antennae quivering. "Multiple heat signatures. They're waiting for us." "Let them," the man replied, his voice as sharp and steady as ever. His gaze was locked on the shadows ahead. "They'll wish they hadn't." A hiss echoed from the darkness, followed by the sharp metallic clatter of enemy soldiers shifting into position. The dim glow of red tactical lights illuminated the outlines of armored figures, tall, plated, and bristling with weapons. They moved like predators, precise and silent, eyes glowing a cold electric blue. The enemy had chosen this hall for an ambush. But it wasn't an ambush. Not for them. The man raised his hand in a signal, and Kravik's crew froze. Not a word, not a sound. The clatter of enemy footsteps drew closer, the glow of their eyes piercing through the fog of smoke. Grix's breath came in shallow, rapid bursts. "They outnumber us 10-1, she whispered, her mandibles clicking nervously. "Then they're going to need reinforcements," the man said, his eyes locked forward. The first enemy soldier stepped into view, his weapon raised, scanning the breach. His head tilted as he spotted the human standing there, completely exposed in the center of the hall. The soldier paused. The human didn't. He moved like lightning, a blur of motion too fast for something his size. 1 second he was standing still, the next he was charging forward. His shoulder collided with the soldier's chest plate, a deafening clang of metal against metal. The enemy was lifted clean off the ground, hurled into the wall with a bone-crushing impact. Sparks exploded as the soldier's armor dented inward, and he crumpled to the ground, unmoving. "Contact!" one of the enemy soldiers shouted, his voice metallic through his helmet comms. Plasma bolts lit up the hall, blue streaks of light zipping through the smoke. The human ducked low, weaving through the chaos with inhuman precision. Plasma bolts hit the walls, sending showers of sparks raining down. "Suppressing fire!" Kravik barked, his deep roar cutting through the blaring alarms. The crew opened fire in unison, their weapons unleashing a barrage of red-hot plasma bolts. The corridor turned into a storm of flashing lights and deafening roars. Enemy soldiers ducked behind cover, their glowing eyes darting as they tried to track the human. But he was already gone. He moved like a ghost. One moment on the left, then suddenly on the right. Every time an enemy thought they had him, he was already behind them. He grabbed one soldier by the arm, twisted it with a snap, and drove his combat knife up into a gap in the armor. The soldier jolted once, then went still. Another swung his rifle toward him, but the human was faster. His hand caught the barrel, wrenched it aside, and drove an elbow into the soldier's visor. The helmet cracked with a loud pop. The soldier staggered, and the human finished him with a hard knee to the chest. "By the stars," Grix muttered, wide-eyed as she watched the carnage unfold. "They're running from him." She wasn't wrong. The remaining enemy soldiers were backing up, retreating toward the far end of the hall. Their movements were panicked, sloppy. The crew could see it now, the way their posture shifted, how their shots went wild, how their glances flicked toward the human, not toward the crew. They weren't fighting the crew. They were fighting him. Kravik laughed, his booming voice filled with vicious delight. "Look at them. They're afraid. The hunters have become prey." He surged forward, claws raised, his massive frame barreling into the enemy line. His sheer weight and momentum sent soldiers sprawling, his plasma rifle spewing bolts of red energy point-blank into their ranks. "Come on, cowards. Let me hear you scream." The tide had turned. Enemy forces crumbled under the weight of the assault. Grix ducked behind cover, laying down precise shots with her carbine, each burst sending enemy soldiers twitching and falling. Kravik was a hurricane of brute force, tossing soldiers aside like leaves. And in the center of it all was the human, untouchable, unstoppable. He darted between enemies, each movement precise and deadly. No wasted effort, no hesitation. One soldier tried to swing a shock baton at him. He caught it mid-swing, twisted it from the soldier's hand, and drove it into his chest. Electricity arced through the soldier's armor, making him convulse before crumpling to the floor. The remaining enemies broke rank. One of them shouted, "Fall back! Fall back!" as they sprinted down the corridor. Their glowing eyes vanished into the smoke and darkness beyond. "Should we pursue?" Grix asked, reloading her carbine. "No," the human said, wiping his knife clean on the nearest body. "They'll be running for the escape pods. They think the fight is over." He looked at Kravik. "But it's not over, is it?" Kravik's eyes gleamed with savage satisfaction. "No. No, it is not." "Then let's finish this," the human said, sheathing his knife and cracking his neck. Time to send a message. The crew advanced through the enemy ship like a wildfire, unstoppable and merciless. Any soldier who tried to stand in their way was met with swift, brutal force. The enemy's comms echoed with desperate orders to regroup, to counterattack, but none of it mattered. Their ship was no longer theirs. They reached the core chamber, a sprawling, circular room at the heart of the ship. Its walls pulsed with veins of energy, and a central reactor hummed with barely contained power. A handful of enemy soldiers stood between the crew and victory. "You still want to fight?" Kravik snarled, leveling his rifle. "Or do you want to run like the rest of your kind?" The soldiers glanced at each other, fear written in every movement. Their weapons trembled in their hands. One of them dropped his rifle and fell to his knees, claws raised in surrender. Another followed. Then the rest. "Smart choice," Grix muttered, eyes narrowing as she kept her weapon raised. They finally figured out what happens when you back a human into a corner. The human stepped forward, looking at the reactor. His eyes scanned the readouts on the control panel. A slow grin tugged at the edge of his mouth. "They wanted a war," he said, his fingers tapping the override console. "Let's give them one." "Wait," Kravik's eyes widened. "Are you detonating their reactor?" The man turned and grinned. "Yes. Yes, I am." A countdown appeared on the console. 10 seconds. "Move." Kravik roared, dragging Grix toward the breach as alarms screamed around them. The surrendered soldiers bolted like wild animals, clawing at each other to get ahead. The crew sprinted through the burning corridors, smoke filling their lungs as the ship shuddered with each passing second. The human was the last one to jump through the breach. As soon as he was clear, Grix hit the emergency seal, locking it shut. On board the Arindra's Claw, they watched from the viewport. The enemy ship, once a hulking monstrosity of war, was now a swelling sun. The core went critical. A silent explosion of light engulfed the ship from the inside out. Metal peeled away like paper, and in seconds, it was gone. Only debris and fire remained. Kravik watched with his arms crossed, a grin of quiet satisfaction on his face. "No crew in the galaxy can do what we just did," he said, his eyes on the human. "That's why every crew needs a human." The man leaned against the wall, blood on his knuckles, soot on his face. "No," he muttered, closing his eyes. "That's why every crew wants one."